Hello, and welcome back to the Cave Escape. I'm Ashton Goolsby,
And I'm Caleb Groves.
and we are back here today to conclude our discussion of philosophy, reading through the liberal arts tradition. Last time we did a kind of a part two of moral philosophy, looking at moral philosophy and how it pertains to community and how it grows in community and is even built up itself by community. And today we're going to be looking at the third type of philosophy, which they label as divine philosophy. So one question that we got to our introduction to philosophy, I don't know, it was 3 or 4 weeks ago, was how does divine philosophy differ from theology? And if you look into divine philosophy, specifically the way they've outlined it in this section, it's really not concerned as much with God per se, as it is, you've got this idea of physics with Aristotle, which is the physical world you encounter, and metaphysics is more of the spiritual, or the, could we say ideal
Kinda, yeah. It's
reality.
It's kind of weird.
But the metaphysics, which we can get into in a second, is more of what's meant by divine philosophy. So not necessarily a study of God. It's you've got this breakdown of the physics, it's the physical world, and then you've got metaphysics or divine philosophy, which I guess we'll get into now. What is metaphysics?
Right. Yeah. That's one thing I've always been a little bit confused about, because when I hear divine, I think God.
Yeah.
But I don't actually think that that's what they mean, and so I've never heard like a different explanation of what that's supposed to mean in the context of metaphysics.
Well, they do begin off here. They say metaphysics is the study of being, or what can be said of all of reality.
Right. Because if it's studying being, then you're studying everything that has existence. And so you're trying to figure out what are things that we can say about everything that has existence. This is where it's kind of like, I don't know exactly where the line is between this and theology, because we say that God is being. So like God doesn't have being, because that would mean that he partakes in something above him. So he is being. He is existence itself. Like he's not a species in the genus of being, because then that puts something above him. He is the genus.
It's like we talk about existing in the mind of God.
Right.
And he is the thing. Well, he even gives us his name is I am that I am.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So we exist because he exists inside of him in a way. So,
and so it's then if we're studying being, you could kind of rephrase that as we're studying God, but it's not really. The focus isn't like there's a difference between the character of God and the aspect of God that he is being, I think. And so, but if we're studying being as being, we have to kind of in some way study God. And I think one of the things they say is like kind of one of the main questions of Christian metaphysics is, what is the relationship between God and his creation? Yeah. Yeah. Because if he is being and we all partake in being, we're all partaking in God, and so it's the study of that relationship there. So there is some theology involved in metaphysics, but it also has to do with like Plato's forms and the ideal forms of things. Like you have the form of a man or a chair. I feel like a chair is almost even a better example, because you can have all kinds of crazy chairs, but you can look at all of them, even if it's a chair you've never seen before, and be like, that's a chair, because you're aware of the form of a chair. That's what Plato's forms are. I don't actually know if we've talked about that on the podcast. We should maybe go into that a little bit.
Probably. But Plato says that you can have a thing in the physical world, but you can only recognize what it is because you know what the form of, like you said, a chair. I mean, we're sitting in these red chairs right now, of which there are more in this room, but then there's a desk chair behind us, and then there's a white wooden chair sitting over in the corner, or there's a rocking chair or an armchair. But there's all these different kinds of chairs, but there's something that makes them chair, and we understand what a chair is. And so he argued that there was some ideal form of a chair that exists, not in the physical reality, but there's an ideal form that we can think of as chair, and somehow everything else that we label chair conforms to that chairness in a way.
Yeah. And when we say ideal, we mean like it is an idea, not like optimal.
Yeah, I guess you should say that. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's not an optimal chair floating in metaphysical space, but there's an idea or form of a chair. Universal also, like a universal form would be kind of another way of phrasing it.
But then that relating to the idea of being, of if we relate it to like ourselves, like what does it mean to be human? So we're examining things based off of what makes it what it is in that ideal, the way we just define it as an idea. What is the idea of man? Or even you want to take it to tree or dirt or rock or chair. But just studying things for what are they in their essence?
Right. Because I remember when we were talking about this in More Philosophy with Mr. Spun, and we would ask, like, what is, like, how do you know? So somebody looks at me and they look at you, and they can tell those are two men, and they can look at this other person and be like, this is also a man. But what is it about us that tells that person that we're all men? And it's not that like we have legs, because if I had my legs cut off, people would still look at me and be like, that person is a human.
Yeah.
And so then that's what metaphysics is it's the study of being and what makes things what they are.
Yeah. But then to me, even the interesting thing is you narrowed it down to man. So there's also, like, we can mean man as a human, but there's also the difference in like man versus woman.
Oh yeah.
Versus dog. But there's something about man and woman that is the same and still different from dog.
Right.
So learning to make the distinctions of, you've got this idea of what a man is, what a woman is, and what a dog is, but then there's also this concept of human that both man and woman fit into, that somehow dog doesn't.
It's a one in the many. Everything comes back to the one in the many.
Did you care to explain that?
Did we talk about that already?
I don't remember if we did.
I
but
feel like
it's
it
probably
came up.
worth
But we should
reiterating
go
anyway.
over it again. One in the many is one of the main, I think, questions of philosophy for like thousands of years, or kind of almost the problem of the one in the many. And that was one thing that the Pythagoreans specifically dealt with a lot. And kind of the question of, sort of like you were just saying, you can have a whole group of people and there's many people there, but at the same time, they're all one thing. They're all people. They're all human. Or you could also think of it as you have a group of bunnies. You have like 7 bunnies that are all in a group. And you have one group that's a singular group. There's a unity there that's a one thing. But within that, there's 7 of them. And so there's like, at the same time, it is both one thing, but also many things on different levels.
It kind of makes me think back to what Mr. Wilbur, when we talked to him about arithmetic and geometry, was saying. We tend to think of even numbers as, well, 5 is its own thing, but we forget 5 is comprised of 2 and 3 and 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 and 1.
Right.
So seeing things as, is it the one in the many, the idea of seeing things as they're composites, or I guess composite, not the word I want, but they're part of a whole, but they're also still somehow individual. Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think so. That's part of it, at least. I don't think that's the whole of it.
But that would be one way of conceiving of how it works.
Yeah, because I think also what would fall into that would be the difference between like the universal form of a thing and then all of its particular instances of it. Like you have the universal form of a chair, and all chairs are one thing within that form. But then you also have a plurality of chairs. And not only can you have multiple chairs that all look the same, but you can have different kinds of chairs. And so there's just kind of everywhere is just kind of, there's that question of the relationship of one and many.
Yeah.
And the overlap and kind of how those, what the interplay of those things.
Yeah, I feel like this is going to be a extra nerdy episode.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Definitely. I love talking about this.
This one's a lot. I feel like this one is a lot more, I guess, thinking on things than it is you can pertain it to something I can physically see and touch. What's more
Yeah,
philosophy
it's
is like
abstract.
I can think of a way it works. Even more philosophy. So like natural philosophy was very, this thing exists. I can touch it. I can feel it. How do I deal with it? More philosophy was a bit more of like relational, but I can still kind
Hmm.
of see it. This is very conceptual. You have to think of it more. It's
Yeah.
more pondering in your mind.
Hmm. Yeah, it is kind of cool, interesting looking at the progression of natural philosophy being almost exclusively in the physical world, and not entirely exclusively, because you're also asking the purpose of things.
Yeah.
But it is also like primarily it's just studying creation.
Hmm.
And then moral philosophy, you're studying creation, but you're also studying relationships, which is not something that's actually physical.
Hmm.
And like we were saying last time, there are things that in moral philosophy and in like quote unquote social sciences
Hmm.
that can't just be proven mathematically. You have to have some kind of other thing, which we would say the Bible, to inform your fundamental beliefs about how things are supposed to work.
Hmm.
And so there's like a mix there. But now we're in metaphysics, and it's just concepts basically.
Yeah.
There is no math to this really. In like the math and science the way that we normally say those things.
And it could be really tempting with something like this to say, well, okay, that's fine if you want to think about it, but what is the necessity of doing this type of study in these very heady kind of almost intellectual things? But they make the argument in here, which I think is true. It keeps us from falling into things like relativism and nihilism. So the idea of basically the way I like to think of nihilism is Bohemian Rhapsody. we can't live in this world of like
Nothing
is
really
this
matters.
yeah nothing really matters, or even the way that a lot of people now think of, well, this is kind of relative to you and your conception of what does it mean to have a chair, or more importantly, obviously, what does it mean to be a man or a woman? What is a woman? A question that's all over the place.
Right.
Thanks to the documentary that was made. That if these truths, they're not relative. There's something in reality that tells me what a man is and what a woman is, what a chair is, what a dog is, what a tree is.
Mhm.
It is a specific thing that I can understand, and it has a specific nature to itself. So it's not relative. It is a certain thing that has certain characteristics, but also it exists with some type of purpose that it's for. So it's not just this nihilistic, well, nothing matters. It's all pointless and meaningless. It exists, it's intelligible, and it has a purpose that it's designed to do.
Yeah. And so in the study of this over time, like we were saying, the point is to see what we can say about being. What are the things that we can say about all of the things that possess existence? And there is a convenient list of 4, potentially 5. I'm still a little bit confused about why the 5th one is kind of like not an official member of the list. But the attributes of being essentially are being, unity, goodness, and truth. So I guess a better name for that list would be the attributes of things that possess existence. Because if I say of being, then being is on the list, and that's kind of confusing. And then beauty. Beauty is the 5th one. So beauty is kind of, I think they say it's sort of implied in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why, and it also didn't come about until later, I think. Because I think like Plato or somebody made that list. And these are the things that, insofar as they exist, they possess these attributes.
Yeah. That makes me think of a conversation I was having with somebody recently. They were saying that as Christians, we struggle with we want truth, but also something beautiful. And sometimes people, especially in the liturgical tradition, get critiqued for, well, they're doing this thing repetitively to be true and try to get everything right, but is it as beautiful? They would argue that it is beautiful, back and forth. So it's this kind of, and even with music and his history, we looked at, I remember in New College, the idea of using music to express truth, but not worrying about so much how elaborate or beautiful it was, and then following the other direction too much.
Mm-hmm.
But I was talking to somebody, and they were making the point. They said, I would rather be focused on not sacrificing beauty rather than truth. And his reasoning for it was, he said, if it's beautiful, it must be true.
Mm-hmm.
So his rationale was, if I say I'm not sacrificing the beauty of something, then I will make sure by default that I've retained what is true. Instead of focusing on truth and then sacrificing the beauty and holding on to the truth, if I focus on the beauty, I'll keep the truth with it. I'm not 100% sure that I agree with that, but I felt like that did pertain to what you were just saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting.
I just kind of wanted your thoughts on that, I guess.
Yeah, I think, so we did talk about that a little bit, I think, when we talked about natural philosophy or the quadrivium, somewhere back in there, when we talked about, I think, Paul Dirac, who I'm pretty sure is a quantum physicist, and talking about focusing on the beauty of the equation rather than whether or not it actually works, or like how it actually works in reality. Obviously, like, an equation that doesn't add up isn't going to be a beautiful equation. So it has to like still work, but he was emphasizing a focus on the beauty of the equation rather than how does this actually work in reality. That was kind of in our conversation about nominalism and the kind of the flip from before everybody was just doing models. This is something to predict the way the planets move, for example. And then we kind of had that spot in the middle where we were actually trying to figure out what was actually happening. But now we've kind of flipped back to nominalism, where because reality means less than it used to, we're worried more about just finding the beauty of the equation, so to speak, rather than focusing on how it actually plays out. And there's an extent to which you do want to focus on the beauty of the equation, because there is beauty in numbers, and there's beauty in the order and way in which God's creation operates. But I don't think that, like what you were just saying, focusing on the beauty brings the truth in with it automatically if you're not focusing on that.
Well, I feel like even then it's too easy if we just get stuck in, well, this is beautiful, and we just do it this way because it's beautiful. Well, why are we doing what we do? And over time we realize, because we've been focusing on trying to preserve something that's beautiful, we forget the truth that's underlying it, and we lose it, and then realize what we have is no longer beautiful, and then we don't know why.
Yeah.
So I would argue, if you have truth, and again, I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head here, but I would think if you have the truth, the beauty will come off of it. But if I'm just striving after the beauty and disregard the truth, I'll lose the truth, and I'll lose the beauty with it as well.
I think that also depends on your understanding of what beauty is.
I guess it's also true. I mean, beauty will, when you make it more relative, as we've done, we say, well, this is beautiful. What we mean by beautiful is, I mean, some guy
pretty colors, or
some guy took a urinal and put it up and said it was art.
Right.
Like, that's not beautiful.
No. Yeah, and so I think, because it kind of depends on, like what you're just saying, your definition of beauty. Because I think if you're working from a correct understanding of what beauty is, then that incorporates truth and unity and goodness. And so, because the transcendentals, the weird thing with the transcendentals is that they're like all the same thing. And it's like when we're talking about the truth of a thing, there is also a sense in which we're talking about the beauty and the goodness and the unity and the being of the thing.
Yeah.
And so, and the reason for that is because all of those things are in God, but everything in God is one, because we talk like the simplicity of God.
Yeah.
So God doesn't have multiple different character traits because he's simple. So all the things we talk about them as multiple different things: God's mercy, God's justice, God's goodness, his beauty, his truthfulness, his righteousness. But all of those things are just God.
Yeah.
And so, because they're all simultaneously one thing in him, and we have to talk about them in these different facets because we're finite creatures that can't understand the fullness of who God is and how he is who he is, then when we're talking about the transcendentals like that, when we're talking about the truth or the goodness or the beauty of a thing, those are all like almost overlap each other entirely.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. I did like too how they go on, kind of going off of that. They go on down here to talk about the church fathers and the medieval theologians were much less interested in comprehending the truth than in participating in it. So talking about the idea of, I mean, there's I guess nothing wrong with trying to understand truth, or definitely the Word of God. I'm not against theology and study and reading theological works and delving deep into it, but the idea of it's not meant to be head knowledge, the participating in it, and they even talk about like there's an element of mystery to it.
Mm-hmm.
It said access to truth meant sacramental participation and the unfathomable mystery of Christ. So we're called to study God and learn about God, but also doing it with the humility to recognize, which I feel like too often, especially in Reformed circles, we're very inclined to think too highly of our theology. But
Yeah.
keeping the humility to recognize Christ and his relationship to the Father, but then just God himself, it's such a mystery how all of that works.
Mm-hmm.
Having the humility to recognize we need to study it, we need to try to, as much as we can, understand it, but we will never be able to actually reach the goal of doing that.
Right.
So doing it with the humility to recognize we're studying it so that we can align ourselves to what's true and we can live in truth, but also recognizing it's a mystery, and we can also take delight in the fact that it's a mystery that we can never fully understand.
Mm-hmm.
Which is part of the resurrection, is then living in community with God for eternity and just eternally trying to understand it better and better and better.
Right.
And better.
Yeah. And I like the way they said participating in the truth meant to be mastered by it rather than mastering it,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is super cool, but I'm still confused about what it means to be mastered by the truth, because that, again, this kind of goes back to the way, like, I was raised in this culture and this is how my brain kind of works, but that just feels like a weird thing to say, that we're going to allow truth and nature, I think kind of like we talked about in natural philosophy, to master us and we submit to it.
Yeah.
Because then there's also the aspect of God gave us dominion over the earth. So how do those things kind of go together? I agree with like not having an attitude of mastering the truth,
Mm-hmm.
but the flip side of that being mastered by the truth is something that I don't really understand how that's supposed to play out.
Well, it made me think of where the Bible says even a child is known by his actions, whether his conduct is pure and right. I wonder if it's the idea of, we know there's an element of, it's faith. We're saved through grace, not through anything that we do. But yet at the same time, we're also commanded to do works, and people are condemned for not doing things or for doing wrong things, like we talked about last time, sins of omission and commission. But the way I've come to understand that is, again, it goes back to what we've talked about the past several episodes for Augustine's rightly ordered loves. If you love what is true, that's going to be worked out in the way you live your life. So that's the way I was thinking of it, was this idea of we search out the truth to participate in it, but then we don't seek to master the truth and kind of assert ourselves over it.
Mm-hmm.
It is master over us. If we find what's true and we know it and we love it and we pursue it, it will become regulatory of what we do in our lives.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So like the kind of internalizing it,
Yeah,
and having
yeah.
it kind of influence and cause certain habits and practices in
Mhm.
you. That makes sense.
Which I would think even goes back to his implications in train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. And I know Doug Wilson somewhere said something about teaching a child to love the standard when they're young. So from a young age, teaching the child, it gets back to education, which is what we've really been talking about for the past several weeks.
Yeah.
Teaching children to know what is true and good and to do it, and over time of faithfully getting them to do good things and to be influenced by good and true things, they will eventually, if done faithfully and, of course, through the work of the Holy Spirit, come to love those things, which is something, I'm not a parent, but struggling as teaching students every day. It doesn't matter a lot of the times if they feel like doing something. They've been called to do this thing. And over time, trusting that, and sometimes I've seen it and sometimes I haven't, and you just trust that it will eventually happen. The child, through doing the things that they don't want to do, but they're just called to do repetitively, they begin doing them on their own, and then they eventually a lot of the times can find joy in doing the thing that when they were younger they hated doing.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes because it was mandatory, and we don't like doing mandatory things.
Right.
But eventually learning, going from not wanting to do it, not doing it, to doing it even though they don't want to then doing it and actually enjoying and taking delight in doing it. And that's another thing I get from the idea of letting the truth master you, letting the truth be over you in that way. It becomes part of you, and then it just kind of is just the way that you live.
Yeah. So allowing it to adjust your appetites to be more directed towards that which is true and good.
Yeah, I think I like that way of putting it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Which, of course, then they go on to say the one of the core questions of Christian metaphysics is how God relates to his creation.
Yeah.
Which is where the theology comes in. Aristotle was not as interested in, when he was doing his metaphysics, with God per se. He was more interested in what is this thing, what is being. But for the Christian, the next logical question is, okay, if I am this, what does that mean to be made in the image of God, or to be even a child of God?
Mm-hmm.
How does this state of my being relate me back to God, which is a step even past what Aristotle would have done.
Yeah, for sure. And they asked a couple questions in this one paragraph that I thought were crazy, and I have no idea how to answer them. But they said, what are the implications for natural science in Colossians 1:15-20, which claims of Christ that in him all things hold together? How does Christ reconcile one and many, quantity and quality, body and soul? So what do you think about that question?
I don't know. It is interesting. And it's definitely something worth thinking about even more. But I mean, there's a sense in which we know in the beginning God created everything with the power of his word. And then we learned from John that Christ is the word.
Mm-hmm.
Which I remember something in Greek and then biblical theology class. Just trying, I mean, we know Christ is the word, and the word is what created and sustains everything. But what does that mean? And even they didn't really offer answers to those questions. They just put them in there, and then next sentence said, "These are deep questions, and metaphysics offers students a path to explore them and to strengthen the tie between faith and reason."
Yeah,
so
that's actually cool.
Yeah,
I mean, I'll let you finish that thought.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, they even kind of admit, I mean, it's just grounds for further study.
Right.
It's again that mystery we can't fully understand what that means. I don't think.
Yeah.
But it's something that it's awesome to look at, and it's true. What exactly it means, I don't know if we can fully understand, but it's certainly exciting to pursue and study.
Yeah. What I was gonna say was to strengthen the tie between faith and reason. And that kind of feels like similar to that question I was asking, I think, last time, talking about like how I feel like believing that what the Bible is true is kind of more based on faith, but faith is probably a lot more rational than we tend to give it credit for. And the difference there of people today thinking of religiously informed thought as less rational than like thoughts that have not been influenced by any kind of religion whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Like it's not as objective. And so, but they were making the statement, or whatever author they were quoting there was arguing that those are actually of equal rationality. And it's just kind of hard for me to wrap my head around the Bible being that rational, because I think of it as much more of a faith thing. But here they're talking about strengthening the tie between faith and reason. And so I guess that's part of what the study of metaphysics does, is because you're studying these things that are real, but you can't actually see them, and they're like real in the abstract, but not real in terms of we can touch them. And so you're kind of in this weird middle ground where you're talking about concepts and abstractions, and you're kind of having to take it on faith, but you're also reasoning your way through it. And so I can kind of see how studying metaphysics would strengthen that tie between faith and reason and kind of show the more rational side of faith.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. So this section was a lot shorter than the other ones. I mean, there's a lot to think about here, but I think a lot of it just relies on the mystery of it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's a difficult concept to introduce. It's a difficult one to pursue and study.
Yes.
But they start in, they're wrapping up. They say there are three broad implications that arise from an overall discussion of philosophy. The first one, they say, is both natural and moral science should be dialectically resituated within a narrative. And they get into what that means. It says there's no one syllogism that can summarize all of reality. That does not mean that there is no truth. On the contrary, syllogisms help reveal truth, but truth is bigger than syllogisms.
Yeah.
So the idea of, if I'm understanding it correctly, they're saying these are systematic approaches to try to understand reality, but reality is more than this. This is just a way to try to attack and understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be fair, do you think?
I think so. Yeah, because it's kind of what metaphysics is doing is showing, kind of like what I was just saying, is that there's these things that aren't necessarily entirely rational, but they're still true. And just because you can't prove them with syllogisms doesn't mean they're not true. Because the truth, like I'm saying, is bigger than syllogisms.
Yeah.
Which I would guess that people would probably take issue with in our post-enlightenment culture. That because the tendency is, if I can prove it with logic, then it's true. And that's all that's true. If you can't prove it with logic, then it can't be true.
Mm-hmm.
And
we very much follow that line of thinking.
Yes, I follow that line of thinking.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That was not a...
Yeah.
That includes me in that as well.
Yeah, yes. Inclusive we. And so... And I also think that makes me think of God again, where like he is bigger than our human understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Like I feel like you kind of make an analogy there of there are all these things that we can do to describe God and understand God, or even prove God in some ways, but we can't actually understand the fullness of who he is because he's bigger than all of that.
Yeah. It makes me think of, too, I believe this is something, again, Mr. Wilbur said when we had him on, but education, you've got the trivium and then the quadrivium and even now this philosophy. We're still examining the same thing, which is God and his truth and his beauty and his goodness, but we're looking at them like you would like a diamond from different points of view.
Yes.
And each time you turn it, you catch something different about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so their way, I feel like what they're saying here is, this is a systematic way of trying to understand really God. But of course, it's something we can't fully understand. It's bigger than us. These are just various ways that we try to understand different aspects of who God is and the world he's placed us to be in. It transcends all of them, but that's also why we don't just pick one way to go about it. We pick, so far, what are we up to? 10 different ways that we've gone through to look at it through the trivium, quadrivium, and then philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
We have these syllogisms to try to understand these things, but understand at some point they are not enough.
Mm-hmm.
We can't get there.
Yeah. And then their second point, which is the need to cover philosophical realism, perhaps even the traditional metaphysical realism within these sciences. And later down they say, the only realism modern science will now countenance is mathematical realism. So that's what we were just talking about, which wholly disregards the transcendentals of goodness and beauty and severely truncates those of truth, being, and even unity. And so that's kind of, I guess we sort of jumped the gun a little bit on the last point because we just kind of talked about that.
So yeah, the idea of this can only get us at the mathematical, but then you have to find a way to talk about what is truth and goodness and beauty, and that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
Then I guess we've already kind of looked at that one, but then moving on to their third point, they said this one's a more subtle point, is that the curricular categories we have advanced in this work should be respected and appreciated by a holistic philosophy. Philosophy itself must be grounded in Christian piety and governed by orthodox and historic Christian theology. So the idea of you have, which is something I feel like they've done a good job of throughout, but you have this philosophy of the ancient Greek philosophers, but it's only properly understood and can only properly be continued using in light of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So Plato and Aristotle, obviously were not Christians, but the reason it's survived so long is because the church saw value in the things that they said, took them, but reworked an understanding of them to point toward God. So recognizing you can study all these things, but ultimately the good that they do is found in Christian theology and the way that they feed into that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they conclude, and together all three of these disciplines, natural, moral, and divine philosophy, will surely lead to a revival of the common aim of both Christian and ancient education, the love of wisdom. Philosophy regained, and theology's handmaiden is restored.
Mm-hmm.
So they're saying, their argument here is basically, this is how we resurrect a Christian culture, is through a proper understanding of natural philosophy, moral philosophy, and divine philosophy, and pointing them back toward Christ. And then they make the claim here that this is the handmaiden of theology. This philosophy goes with theology, which is what we'll get more into next time, is the theology.
Yeah. Well, that brings us to the end of our time for this episode. We should have a summary up on the blog, per usual. Please leave us any comments, questions you have about anything, critiques, anything like that.
And for next time, we will try to figure out what that weird clicking noise has been this whole time.
Yes. Assuming it's on the recording.
Yes, and not just our headphones.
But thank you for listening, and until next week, take care.